Welcome to class number 12, everyone. In our last class, we learned two very important investment concepts: the time value of money and the risk-return relationship. In this class, we're going to begin exploring a very specific economic phenomenon that, if present, will eat away at your investment returns and your money. This phenomenon is called inflation. You may have heard about inflation before, but it's often not well explained or even understood. I'm going to clear that up for you. Inflation is so crucial to understand, we'll cover it over two classes: this video and our next one, class number 13. Let's go. In order to properly understand inflation, it's important that we first learn a key aspect of money. What purpose does money serve? You may say that it buys things, which is true, but the primary purpose of money is to store value. In theory, when you go to work, you're expected to provide some type of value to your employer. Otherwise, why would they pay you? In return, you expect to be paid something of value. Otherwise, why would you work? Employment is simply an exchange of value. Before money was invented, workers were rewarded with things they needed, like food, clothing, and shelter. In ancient Mesopotamia, records indicate that workers were even paid with beer. Ancient civilizations relied on bartering to exchange value. If I had extra clothing and you had extra food, and I needed food and you needed clothing, we could negotiate an exchange that would help both of us. Bartering isn't the most efficient system, since I would still need to find someone who has what I need and needs what I have. That takes time. If only we could use something that could store value until we needed to do an exchange. Well, thankfully, a brilliant mind long ago thought of using precious metals like gold, silver, and copper as a store of value. These metals are rare and could not be made out of thin air. Finally, the world had something reliable where value could be stored for the future. Eventually, societies decided to assign numbers to the metals, and this is where money really took shape. The Romans created the denarius as their currency, where 100 denarii represented 1 ounce of gold. In many societies since the Romans, gold, silver, and copper coins represented various denominations of money. Over time, paper currency was invented. This paper currency was usually backed by precious metals, meaning it was equivalent to and exchangeable for a certain amount of, say, gold that was held in vaults and was easier to carry around. In other words, its value was fixed to a certain amount of gold set by a government. In the United States, this system lasted until 1933, when President Roosevelt, in response to the Great Depression, ordered all gold coins and paper money backed by gold, also called gold certificates, to be turned in exchange for paper money, which was not exchangeable for gold. From 1944 until 1971, the US dollar's value was again linked to the value of gold. This ceased in 1971, and since then, the US dollar has been known as a fiat currency. That is, it is solely backed by the full faith and credit of the US government. The U.S. government controls the supply of money in the U.S. through an entity known as the Federal Reserve Bank, also called the Federal Reserve or simply the Fed. The Fed is the central bank of the United States government. A central bank is completely different than the banks we use every day. It is responsible for, among other things, regulating the supply of money in our financial system, setting baseline interest rates, regulating the country's banks, overseeing the monetary system, and acting as a lender of last resort to troubled financial institutions and governments in times of economic distress. The Fed was created by Congress in 1913 and now has three primary responsibilities or mandates. First, it must work to keep prices stable. We'll talk about this one in a minute. Second, it must work to achieve maximum employment in the U.S. In other words, keep unemployment as low as possible. And the third, lesser known mandate is to keep long-term interest rates stable. It's important to understand that the Fed is not part of the three branches of the federal government. It's an independent governmental agency run by a board of governors who answers to the legislative branch of the government, U.S. Congress. This structure is intended to keep the Federal Reserve independent of political influence. Whether this intent is upheld is up for debate. The three branches of government, the executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch, are responsible for implementing revenue and spending policies of the federal government. The federal government collects revenues primarily through taxes, such as income tax, and spends money through a variety of programs, such as defense spending, infrastructure spending, Medicare, Social Security, and other social welfare programs. Now that we understand how our monetary system, the Fed, and our U.S. government are structured, let's begin discussing inflation. What is inflation? Inflation simply refers to an increase in the price of something over time. There can be inflation in specific assets like real estate, in goods like food, and in services like airfare. As we'll learn in a future lesson, the price of anything is a function of its supply and demand. Supply and demand can change for many reasons, one of which is the availability of money, as we'll see in a minute. These factors change often, which is why prices change often. The federal government is not particularly concerned with fluctuations in the price of individual assets, goods, or services. Many of these things are bought and sold in a free market, that is, mostly free from regulation. One exception is utilities. Things like water, electricity, natural gas, and sewage services are so important to a society running effectively that the government sets limits on how high prices can go. It's also true that utility providers operate essentially as monopolies in areas of the country, as the only provider of these services to certain towns, cities, etc. What the government and the Fed are heavily concerned with is widespread inflation. That is, inflation across a wide range of goods and services. This is the kind of inflation that you hear about in the news. And as we continue with this class, this widespread inflation is what we are referring to when we say inflation. Since prices of goods and services change all the time, and there are so many goods and services in our economy, The government needs a way to do a high-level look. They do so by estimating overall inflation. The two primary estimates of inflation are called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, and the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, or the PCE. The PCE is the preferred inflation gauge of the Federal Reserve, but the CPI is most widely noted in the media. For purposes of this lesson, we're going to use the CPI. CPI is an estimate of the general level of prices for goods and services paid for by the average consumer. The CPI is calculated based on a basket of goods and services that the average consumer would purchase, such as housing, food, clothing, etc. It's measured, calculated, and published monthly by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is a division of the U.S. Department of Labor. The change in CPI from one year to another is called the inflation rate. If you hear inflation was 8% in 2022, this means that the price of goods and services as measured by the CPI increased 8% from December 31st, 2021 to December 31st, 2022. From 2014 through 2023, the CPI increased on average about 2.5% per year. That is, the price of goods and services increased about 2.5% per year. The 8 categories of goods and services that the CPI measures are housing, food and beverage, medical care, recreation, clothing and apparel, transportation, education and communication, and other. As you can probably guess, some categories are weighted higher than others based on the relative percentage of income people on average spend on them. The data used to estimate the CPI primarily comes from various surveys of consumers and vendors. When prices rise, the purchasing power of the US dollar decreases. Think of buying a cup of coffee for $1 in January, and then by December, that same cup of coffee is $2. In this simple example, coffee prices increased by a 100% inflation rate. That is to say, the price doubled. The power of your money just declined. As you can see, inflation eats away at the value of our money. You might be wondering what causes prices to change and how can this be managed? I don't want to overwhelm you with information, so we'll cover all this in our next lesson, class number 13. If you have any questions at all, please contact me at opusmonetequestions@gmail.com or comment below, and I will try my best to get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks for watching. We rely heavily on recommendations. Please follow us on Instagram, subscribe to us, and like this video on YouTube, and share our program with your friends and family. See you all in class number 13. Peace!